welcome. Today we're going live talking about Genesis chapter 30. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob to no children, she envied her sister. She said to Jacob, "Give me children, or I shall die." Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of your womb?" Then she said, "Here is my servant Bilhah. Go into her, so that she may give birth on my behalf, that even I may have children through her." So she gave him to her servant Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, "God has judged me, and has also heard my voice and given me a son." Therefore she called his name Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said with mighty wrestlings, "I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed." So she called his name Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Then Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son, and Leah said, "Good fortune has come." So she called his name Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son, and Leah said, "Happy am I, for women have called me happy." So she called his name Asher. In the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?" Rachel said, "Then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes." When Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come into me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he lay with her in that night, and God listened to Leah. And she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, "God has given me my wages because I gave my servant to my husband." So she called his name Issachar. And Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a sixth son. Then Leah said, "God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will honor me, because I have borne him six sons." So she called his name Zebulun. Afterward she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, "God has taken away my reproach." And she called his name Joseph, saying, "May the Lord add to me another son." So let's take a pause there because that's a whole lot. That's a whole lot. And there's a lot of names and there's a lot of good meat in that. So let's talk about it. So we start off this chapter. We're focusing on Jacob. Jacob had just exited a situation where he had been on the run after having tricked his brother, taken the blessing, covered himself with goat skin, received the blessing from his father, and now he was on a run. He had run off to Laban's house. That was his mom's brother or his uncle. He ran off to that house, but he saw this beautiful woman named Rachel. And he was smitten with Rachel, and he immediately knew he wanted to marry Rachel. He goes and he works 7 years to marry Rachel. He's given to Rachel, right, supposedly, at the altar, marries her, goes home, lays down with her, only to wake up super surprised. He wakes up frightened. He ended up with the older slash uglier, less favorable sister named Leah. So he woke up having had sex with the wrong woman, and it was Leah, and he was beside himself. He goes back to Laban, and he's like, "Laban, you lied. You gave me the wrong girl. This is a problem." And Laban looked right at him and said, "Look, dude, you are the liar. You over here lying to your dad, getting the blessings, lying to your brother, stealing for a living, and you're asking me about lying?" So Laban laughed and Jacob understood the assignment. He understood he had to go ahead and work another 7 years and try to get Rachel. And that's what he did. He ended up working a total of 14 years for Rachel. This is where this part of the story begins. This man, can you guys even fathom being a man who just worked for 14 years for someone? On top of that, he's in the house with the wife who he considers the ugly one. He considers the old one. So this is a mess. And imagine what this is like for the woman. Like, let's cut to the chase for a second. You guys, can you guys feel me on that? If you've been a woman and been in a relationship with someone who didn't appreciate you, who didn't honor you, who didn't respect you, and like the darkness that happens to a person when they go through that. Y'all, that's rough. That is what Rachel, I mean, that's what Leah was going through, except she's married to him. She's married to someone who has an eye for other women. In this case, I'm not going to say women. He's got an eye for another woman. And every day you wake up and go to sleep, you know he's got an eye for another woman. Every day you wake up and go to sleep, he is yearning for something and working hard for something, and it's not you. Like, that is Leah's life. Every day, this guy's going out there dealing with animals, herding animals and taking care of them and feeding them. But he's not doing that for you. He really doesn't want you. That is Leah's life. This is every day. Like, she woke up after her wedding on her honeymoon, having lost her virginity, right? This is the situation for women in that day. So this is a vulnerable moment. She lost her virginity and she wakes up and she's stressing because this man is like, you're not it. You're not it. I didn't want you and I don't want you and I can't adjust to it. That's what's going on here, y'all. That's like when you put yourself in her shoes for a second, Leah belonged to her father. She belonged to her father's home. And she trusted her father to give her a husband. And her father did that. Her father gave her a husband. He put her in harm's way. He put her with the man who really wasn't going to love her, who couldn't love her, who didn't plan on being with her, and was too shocked and surprised by the deception to even be able to fully receive her as a wife. So when I tell you it's tough, y'all, it's tough. Do you know what I mean? It's really, really tough. So that's Leah's position in this. It's a tough position to be a woman and want to be like desired and adored and loved. And you're itching for that love and you can't get it. No matter what, you just can't get it. So that's where Leah's at. And this beginning of Genesis chapter 30 really opens the door to talking about the tension between Leah and this need for the love of her husband, and also the tension between Leah and noting that her sister has the heart of her husband. Ugh. I mean, when you know your man might be liking somebody else, that's bad enough. When you know he might be liking someone else to the extent that he's like, smelling good and getting his hair cut and dressing up for someone else, that's horrible. But Jacob didn't do all that just to do all that. He was doing it for her sister of all people. So that's where we start off. And so it starts with the idea that Leah, although Leah was less favorable to man, Jacob in this specific case, she wasn't less favorable to God. So you can see how God was working in this. To give a blessing to Leah despite her hardship, and the blessing was children, but also he was using this plan to grow the nation of Israel. So we find that pretty cool that Jacob, whose name eventually becomes Israel, Jacob is being used by God. God's working his plan through Jacob to build his nation. So that's happening. So we hear that Rachel's barren in the beginning of Genesis chapter 30. And then we start to hear that because Rachel is barren, Rachel is looking to give her servants over to her husband. And so we're beginning to see that humans are driving human solutions for human problems rather than looking sometimes for the dependency of God. And so it's a challenge for us all to, when we get to the midst of our worst circumstances, it's a challenge for us to say, can we, in the midst of our worst circumstances, begin to depend on God rather than depend on ourselves? That's number one. So when we look at it, she Rachel positions her husband to um, have sex with Bilhah, her servant. Me and my blankets, y'all. I always got like 1,001 blankets. Like, rename myself blanket or something. Um, so yeah, she gives her servant to her husband, and then the husband succeeds and has a pregnancy with Bilhah. Um, and then they call that child Dan. And then lo and behold, Bilhah conceives again, and they call that child Naphtali. So these names actually mean something. Let's talk about some of these names and what they mean. And so for Rachel, Dan, Dan meant God has vindicated me, and Naphtali meant my wrestling. There was a my wrestling going on there. So there's a story like here with Rachel where Rachel couldn't get pregnant. She was barren and she was struggling and she was stressed because even though she was more beautiful and more young, when a woman gets married, they oftentimes expect to be able to be fertile and reproduce. They kind of come with that expectation. And oftentimes, the man is coming with the expectation that they should also be able to reproduce. So, this idea that after Leah is having baby after baby after baby, and then the servants start, having their babies and all these things, it's like Rachel's sitting there like, what about me? What about me, God? Like, where are my blessings? And we see that that's when she felt that God had vindicated her by giving her a child through her servant named Dan. That's why she named him that, because God had vindicated her in her thought. And the vindication, Rachel was looking at this not so much for like faith, she was looking at this as though she was vindicated by God, looking at her barrenness and looking at the fact that Leah had had all these babies. It's like, oh wow, God's vindicating her with her sibling rivalry. That's how Rachel looked at it. And then when the next son, Naphtali, was born from the servant, it was considered the meaning, the explanation is my wrestling. So this was all kind of representing some success for her in the midst of a difficult situation. But I will say, there's a lot going on here. When you think about what happened right before this, her sister had four kids back to back, naturally, just like, she opens the door pregnant, blinks her eyes pregnant, and anyone who struggled with infertility, they kind of understand like what Rachel was going through in that moment, the difficulty of feeling just, what about me? How come? And when is it going to happen? Those feelings that start to percolate up. So Leah's first son was Reuben, and it was because the Lord could see her affliction. That's why Reuben was named Reuben. It meant the Lord sees my affliction. So the affliction for Leah was that she was less favorable, more old, less attractive, and her husband just didn't love her. So that was seen as an affliction. So Reuben's name meant the Lord sees affliction. And some people would say it says look a son. There's a couple of different ways of looking at it, but that's some of what comes from that name. And then Simeon, the Simeon was our second son, Leah's second son that was born. And again, it was Leah having kid after kid after kid, Rachel sitting there bearing the whole time. Simeon was born, and his name is described as to hear, or the Lord hears. And it shows that even though she was hated by her husband, not desired by her husband, that the Lord hears her prayers, hears her needs. And then Leah gets pregnant again, back to back to back. And Levi was born. Levi was born during a time that she was hoping that her husband would attach to her. So his name means something like hope for attachment. So she's naming her kids through her experience and through her faith in God. And finally, the fourth son is born to Leah, Judah. Judah's name means something like praise for the Lord or God be praised, because even though she kept getting pregnant and her husband never attached her and never loved her, she decided in the midst of her circumstances that she would still praise the Lord. And I feel like that's a word for somebody out there. If you've like lost something, if you've lost your job, lost your partner, lost your puppy, lost a human being in your life, it's like it's a challenge for us to praise God in the midst of our circumstances, even though in our human circumstances everything seems awful. And that's where she was at. Leah had lost her virginity and got married to this man, and he was just ignoring her and not loving her properly, not honoring her as a wife. And his outward acts were a struggle for another woman. And that other woman happened to be in her family and happened to be her sister. And so she's over here, and God is blessing her womb, and she's having baby after baby, but she's still never getting that love. And every time she has another baby, she just knows that God's gonna give her a husband that loves her. But that man is not loving her, and that man only has kind of eyes for her sister of all people. So it's a painful story, Genesis chapter 30. But it's also a story that I think a lot of us can relate to, because likely at some point, if you've dated for long enough, then you've probably had someone, either male or female. If you're a woman, then you probably had a guy who didn't like you the way you hoped that he liked you. And if you're a guy, you probably had someone who didn't respond the way you hoped for them to respond. And so we've all been there where we feel like it just didn't go the way I hoped for it to go. And that's where Leah was in terms of her likability in the marriage. And that's where Rachel was in terms of her barrenness in the middle of a marriage. It wasn't going the way either of them hoped for it to go. And we're seeing this struggle of what happens when we're doing something of our own strength and not doing kind of precisely what God wants. Because at the end of the day, God's design, despite the fact that people point to things like this and say that God loves polygamy and we should be polygamous, actually, that's not God's design, because in the very beginning of the book of Genesis, God had an opportunity to make many women from one man, and he didn't. He made one woman for one man. And then later there was a conversation about two becoming one flesh. So it was never really God's design that we would have multiple people in a marital covenant and trying to just do this whole group partnership thing. And you can see God's not the author of confusion, but we see the fighting and bickering between the two women are constantly happening because it's the human side of them being in a group situation when they're not really designed to be that way, because we have a jealous nature and we want to feel loved and appreciated. So yeah, so we see all that. So again, Leah, before chapter 30, Leah had her four sons. She had Reuben, she had Simeon, Levi, and then Judah. And then after that, we finally see that Rachel begins to use her servant to reproduce, and they have Dan and Naphtali. Dan, whose name means God has vindicated me, and then Naphtali, whose name indicates my wrestling. And then we can see them going on and on. We see, more children are starting to come and formulate, but it's not that Rachel's had a physical child of her own. Does that make sense? These children are being born of Leah's physical body. These children are being born of Rachel's servant's body. And then we see again, Leah's still waiting. I mean, Rachel is still waiting for that pregnancy. And so it comes a point where there's an opportunity for, instead of prayer and seeking the Lord, Rachel Rachel sees that Leah's son's got mandrakes in the field, and the mandrakes were kind of an aphrodisiac potentially, or something that could help produce a baby. It was looked at as something that could help reproduction. And instead of them again going to God and saying, God, I really would love this baby, Rachel looked at the mandrakes and said, you know what? These mandrakes are going to help me. I want a human solution for my human problem. And what does she do? She goes and she negotiates away time with her husband in order to have access to those mandrakes. So there was a Genesis chapter 30, it's around verse 14. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? Rachel said, then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes. And then when Jacob came home, they actually did that. So you could see this tension between Rachel and Leah, not just over mandrakes, but over the man. So there's tension there. Rachel's desperate. She thinks the mandrakes are going to make a difference. She exchanges time with her husband for the mandrakes. And what happens? Poof, Leah's pregnant again. And Leah's pregnant with another baby. And this is going to be, looks like Issachar. And that's the fifth son, right? And then Leah gets pregnant again, and that's the sixth son. And this one's gonna be Zebulun, and then she's pregnant again, and then this one is with Dinah, the daughter. And so then it says in Genesis chapter 30, verse 22, then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. So the desperation was so deep in this story. It's unbelievable. Both women were desperate in different ways. You know, Leah was desperate for the love of her husband. She was desperate to have him to herself and to not feel like number two constantly. You know, Rachel, on the other hand, was desperate to get pregnant. And it was like she would have done anything to get pregnant, you know? And then it starts talking about Jacob's prosperity. In the second half, it says, as soon as Rachel had born Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go to my home and country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, that I may go, for you know the service that I have given you. But Laban said to him, if ye found favor in your sight, I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Name your wages, and I will give it. Jacob said to him, you yourself know how I have served you, and how your livestock have fared with me. For you had little before I came, and it has increased abundantly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned. But now when shall I provide for my own household also? He said, what shall I give you? Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. If you will do this for me, I will again pasture your flock and keep it. Let me pass through all your flocks today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep, every black lamb, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and they shall be my wages. So my honesty will answer for me later. When you come to look into my wages with you, every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and black among the lambs, if found with me, shall be counted stolen. Laban said, good, let it be as you've said. But that day Laban removed the male goats, and there were striped and spotted, and all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had white on it, and every lamb that was black, and put them in the charge of his sons. And he set a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob pastured the rest of Laban's flock. Then Jacob took fresh sticks of poplar and almond and plane trees. Actually, I'll stop right there and comment on that. So Jacob's ready to go back to his hometown. He's ready to take his family. He's prospered Laban's household. Both he and Laban recognize that Jacob's responsible for prospering Laban's household. And he says, he gives it to the Lord. The Lord has prospered you abundantly through me, through my work here. So let me go. So Jacob is negotiating to go home to his country. However, Laban is like, I recognize that God's prospered me through you, even though I learned through divination. He's like, I still recognize the Lord is the Lord in this case. So I want you to stay, So sneaky Laban wants him to stay, and kind of sneaky Jacob wants to leave. And don't forget, Jacob was named, his name was representing like grasping the heel. That's what his name kind of meant, because he was always cheating something. He cheated his brother out of his birthright, cheated and got the blessing from his father when he was covered in goat skins. And nevertheless, this is also him looking like he's planning on selectively breeding in order to again cheat Laban. And so Jacob is living up to his name, and then Laban is being the same old Laban he's always been. Although Laban knows that having Jacob there is useful to him financially, when the deal is struck, he accepts it because he's like, oh wait, all the spotted ones, you're gonna take all the spotted ones? I'm gonna win in this deal. Why does he think he's gonna win? Because his plan was to go take all the spotted ones, hide them from the others, and there should be no way for the DNA to do what it needs to do to produce spotted, speckled anything, or if anything, they'd be very limited. So Laban removes the speckled and spotted animals so that when the next set of animals were breeded, that there's no way to have a bunch of speckled animals. And so Laban was up to his regular old tricks. He's being Laban. Same old guy, different day. And then Jacob thinks, he's planning on doing some selective breeding. And so that's when he gets into the next piece. So they made their agreement. Both men thought that they were going to outwit the other man. And then we end up here. Then Jacob took fresh sticks of poplar and almond and plane trees and peeled white streaks in them, exposing the white of the sticks. He set the sticks that he had peeled in front of the flocks in the troughs, that is, the watering places, where the flocks came to drink, since they bred when they came to drink. The flocks bred in the front of the sticks, so that the flocks brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted. And Jacob separated the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the stripes and all the black in the flock of Laban. He put his own droves apart and did not put them with Laban's flock. Whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob would lay the sticks in the troughs before the eyes of the flock, that they might breed among the sticks. But for the feebler of the flock, he would not lay them there. So the feebler would be Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man increased greatly and had large flocks, female servants and male servants, and camels and donkeys. So this is starting to talk about the fact that nothing was really innocent. Jacob was not innocent in how he was breeding. He was trying in his human way, trying to selectively breed the animals, trying to place little items in front of the animals to create this element of surprise so that the animals would come out spotted. He was doing what he could do to try to manipulate the process. And at the end, what happens is the man increased greatly and had large flocks, female servants and male servants, and camels and donkeys. So we see the result is that he was still abundant in the breeding technique, but that was not because of his technique. It was because God was the source of the solution. So God had chosen to bless the patriarch of the family, Jacob, rather than Laban. So God's blessings and plans are going to come to fruition. And especially if it's part of his will and his plan, it's going to come to fruition. So we see some of that there. So really, Jacob is thinking he's trying to do something to manipulate the process, but he already admitted in the earlier piece that God was responsible for all the abundance that came to him, which was given and gained by Laban. He understood at the source that God's always in control, but he still was, in his human thought, he thought he was going to be digging around and selectively breeding and producing odd shaped, odd spiked, I'm sorry, spotted animals. He thought he was going to be producing spotted animals, so that he could take those spotted animals with him. And he was also hoping to produce weaker animals to leave behind for Laban. So a lot of sneaky business still happening between these two guys, but God was ultimately in control and decided to bless the patriarch. And similarly with the women, God was in control, ensuring that the servants were reproducing for Jacob, that the women were reproducing, albeit Leah reproduced more for Jacob. That was part of God raising up the afflicted, the person that was seen as the lesser of the two. And we see that storyline happening over and over within the Bible, that the lesser of the two, or the less qualified, is lifted up, um, because God is in charge of lifting them up. We see that over and over. So hopefully that one helps you guys. You see a lot of pain in the eyes of Leah for being the less favored wife. And we see a lot of pain in the eyes of Rachel for waiting and waiting and waiting for God's blessing on her own womb to open. And then we see Jacob struggling with the tension of dealing with two wives who don't get along. We see Jacob being passed around from servant to wife to wife to servant, and really, but at the same time, God using that to help build the nation of Israel, which Jacob's name eventually becomes Israel. And we're seeing that all of these children that are being birthed, that these are going to be the ancestors, which we call like the sons of Israel, or the sons of Israel. Eventually, we just consider them that way. Very, very cool and interesting things that we see in the book of Genesis, chapter 30. Taking a look a little bit. Here's a beautiful diagram, which you can't see a whole lot of, but that's a nice little diagram of Abraham's family from beginning to end. And you could see this line here kind of points to all of those children that were born because of Jacob and his multiple marriages and the relationships that he had with the servants. You can kind of see, like, in that line item there, we can see all of those children came from those relationships between Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, Zilpah, that just a whole lot of kids. And each one was named with a special name for a special reason. And it was all kind of related to the experience that the mothers were having. So we'll continue on with this later, but I hope that one found you. I hope you guys liked a little bit of the stuff that we gave you on the names, because I think it's kind of interesting that the names carried so much meaning, that it wasn't as random as one would have it be. Even Gad and Asher towards the end, Gad's name meant fortune, Asher's name meant happy one or happiness. And these were Leah's, the children that Leah had through her maid Zilpah. So it's just, we're seeing that, as Leah kept having children, she felt prosperous, and she felt happy from that. And this was God's way of showing her some sort of favor despite her affliction or her difficult circumstances. But yeah, a lot of that. And we see Zebulun, God has endowed me with a good dowry, because that's where her husband could actually honor her. So it's just a lot of stress related to these women trying to conceive and bear children and get the love of their husband, and just constantly them trying to receive that love and that honor in some kind of way. A lot of falling short is what I would describe it as. But still, yet and still, God honoring all of that despite the circumstances, God honoring it by continuing to bless. Rachel had the son Joseph, right? Joseph, the name meant may he add or may he increase. Such a cool situation because when Rachel finally had her own blood son, um, that son was kind of a favor of the bunch by Jacob. He did favor that son quite a bit, which we later will find creates its own set of difficult circumstances with again jealousy. We'll see that later, but we can see that eventually, Rachel's womb is opened. She has a son of her own. She has Jacob, and that begins a whole nother separate dynamic. But you know, what we can learn from this is Leah was a woman of faith, and she was faithful, praising God despite her difficult circumstances and her affliction. Rachel, she was struggling with just being what's the word, patiently waiting on her blessing. She was struggling with that, but it didn't deter her plans, even though she was taking things into her own hands and Leah was taking these things into her own hands. It didn't deter God's plan for their lives. And I think that is a message of hope, I think, in this, is that even though we, in our human responses to earthly situations, we may try to take things into our own hands and we may mess things up and make a bigger mess for ourselves sometimes. It won't stop the overall plan of God. When God has a plan for us, it'll come to fruition. Even if we're over there meddling with things and messing things up, like God's plan, God is greater than our mistakes. He can bring something to fruition even if we're making messes out of it continuously. He can still figure out how to use the things that we're doing and still make his plan come to pass. So that is the hope in this. And the hope is that, God had a plan that started before they were involved, before they were married off, before they were connected and interconnected amongst all the group. God had a plan before that. And we're seeing the nation of Israel being built in front of our very eyes. And how beautiful is that? Eventually, we'll learn more about each one of those kids, how they became the patriarch, the early ancestor of the tribe of the sons of Israel. And that comes with some semblance of politics and other social related concerns. And we'll see that as we move through it. But hope this one finds you guys well. Join me next time we go live with the Victory Life podcast. Bye, everybody.